Welcome to topic 3.3, Congressional Polarization. The goal here is for you to be able to describe the impact polarization is having on Congress. You'll remember that polarization is when Democrats get more liberal and Republicans get more conservative, and there really isn't a lot of incentive for the two sides to talk to each other. Welcome to the third topic of Unit 3 Congress. Today we'll be discussing congressional polarization. Your goal today, by the end of the notes, is to be able to describe the impact polarization is having on Congress. You'll hopefully remember from a previous lesson that polarization is when Democrats are getting more liberal and Republicans are getting more conservative, and fewer people in the middle. This chart demonstrates the polarization among the American public based on surveys that ask people about their political ideologies. The further left on the chart, the more consistently liberal the people are. The further right, the more consistently conservative they are. Republicans are demarcated by the red, and Democrats by the blue. You can see here that when we start in 1994, the median Democrat, or the average Democrat, is right here, and the median Republican, the average Republican, is right here. So you can see their views are pretty close together. What this means is half of Democrats in 1994 are more conservative in this, and half of the Democrats are more liberal. Same thing with Republicans. Half of the Republicans are more conservative than this person, and half are more liberal than this person. This results in a lot of overlap between Democrats and Republicans being both conservative and liberal, and when there's a lot of overlap between these ideologies, it makes it easier to compromise and get laws passed that most people can agree with. Looking at this data over time, you see some trends develop. So right here, you have the data from 1994. Again, Democrats and Republicans, there's a lot of overlap. Look at this huge purple mountain in the middle. By 2014, you're seeing that mountain has gotten shorter, and the average Democrat has gotten more liberal, the average Republican has gotten more conservative. By 2017, you see this go even further, with the average Republican and the average Democrat even further apart, and the middle group getting smaller and smaller. You'll note that 2017 was just after President Obama had finished his second term and President Trump was beginning his second term. If you looked at the same data from 2024 or 2025, when I'm filming this video, you'd see this divide even further with there even fewer people in the middle. This is what I mean by the American electorate is getting more and more polarized. So today we're going to look at the impact this polarization on voters has had on Congress. So again, a working definition of polarization, just quick review here, is it's when voters are moving further and further to the extremes in their political ideologies. So liberals are getting more liberal, conservatives are getting more conservative. You can see this happen drastically between 94 and 2014 among the politically engaged. That is, the people who are really involved in politics, who either are knocking on doors and making calls for politicians during elections, or who are at the very least watching a lot of news and trying to make sure they're keeping up on what's going on. So you see in 94, they're pretty close together. In 2004, still pretty close, but that divide is growing a little bit. But by 2014, you've got this massive chasm between the politically involved Democrat and the politically involved Republican on average. Now, the same thing is happening among the less engaged, where they're closer together in 1994 than the more engaged are, and they're still pretty close together in 2004 when the politically engaged are starting to separate. But by 2014, you're noticing that separation is happening even among the less engaged, the people who are paying less attention to politics. Again, if I were to show you a chart from 2024 to 2025, you'd see this divide growing even further. You'll remember from the lesson in class when I had you read an article on this, polarization leads to some problems among voters. First and foremost, it leads to what we call otherization or othering of people. Seeing people who are not in your political group as so different from you that it's really hard to understand who they are, where they're coming from, or why they do the things they do. In essence, polarization makes us see our political opponents as extremely different from us, even if, in fact, we agree on more than we actually disagree on. Othering then leads to aversion, seeing them not just as different, but unpleasant and unlikable. You just don't want to spend time with them, so you choose not to be friends with people who have different political ideas than you. If you have family members who have a different political idea than you stop talking to them. Eventually, people even take this to the extreme and move to communities where everyone who lives around them and works with them share the same political ideas. This puts people into bubbles where they think that everyone who has common sense agrees with them, and further increases the idea of othering the people who disagree with you, because if everyone around you agrees with you, then those who don't are, well, they're just weird. And once you start thinking of them as weird, you start to moralize it. You believe that they're not just different, but they're actually morally wrong and bad. So you see someone who has different political opinions than you as not just someone you disagree with, but someone who's actually evil. This is why polarization is so dangerous. Partisanship is similar to polarization. Whereas polarization is about getting more and more extreme in your political ideologies, partisanship is when you become more and more loyal to your political party. And through that loyalty, you refuse to compromise with members of the other political party. Partisanship is a natural outgrowth of polarization, especially in America's two-party system where liberals are generally Democrats and conservatives are generally Republicans. Now, this wasn't always true. There used to be liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, so there used to be a lot of overlap within the parties. Just like you can measure how liberal or conservative voters are, you can measure how liberal or conservative members of Congress are. This chart over here on the left shows the polarization and the partisanship happening in the Senate. So you can see here this 0.0 line would be someone who's exactly in the middle of the political spectrum. And what you're noticing here is the further left it gets, the more liberal the members of the Senate are getting. The further to the right you get, the more conservative members of the Senate are getting. Now, don't exactly worry about the numbers, just look at the size of the differences. So, for instance, Democrats in general in the Senate are getting slightly more liberal by a 0.06 change, whereas Republicans have gotten more conservative by a 0.28 change. This essentially means that Republicans in the Senate have gotten almost 5 times more conservative than Democrats have gotten more liberal. If you look over at the House, you're seeing a similar trend. In this case, Republicans in the House are getting about 3.5 times more conservative than Democrats in the House are getting more liberal. So, while both parties are getting more polarized and are becoming more partisan, we're seeing the data showing that Republicans are getting more conservative than the Democrats are getting more liberal. This is happening in both the Senate and in the House. That's just what the data is showing. This chart shows you the number of members of the House of Representatives who identify with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party and their ideological leanings from 1982 all the way until 2012. You notice here that the red line represents the Republican Party and the blue line represents the Democratic Party. This arrow right here represents the most conservative Democrat. Now you'll remember, Democrats are generally liberal. Over here, this arrow represents the most liberal Republican. Again, most Republicans are conservative. So what you're seeing here is that in 1982, there was a lot of overlap. 344 of the 435 voting members of the House are kind of in the middle, wedged between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. So take a moment and see if you can see a difference between Congress in 1982 and Congress in 2012. Go ahead and pause the video for a moment and just see if you can see the difference, what's going on here. You'll notice between 1982 and 2012, the number of members who fall between these two points has actually been drastically shrinking. So whereas in 1982, the vast majority of members of the House of Representatives were somewhere in between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, by 2012, there are only 11 members who are in that overlapping in-between area. And if you extended this out to 2025, the year I'm recording this in, that number is pretty much 0. Now stop and think about how this trend is likely going to impact the House's ability to pass laws. So pause the video and think about that. Hopefully you came up with the idea that when there's fewer liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, that means there's a lot fewer people in this middle, it's going to be harder for members of Congress to compromise and actually get laws passed. And that's actually what we're seeing happen with Congress being less productive now than it has been, well, at any point since right before the Civil War. Laws aren't getting passed, nothing's getting done, and it's because the Democrats and Republicans can't agree to work with each other, and that's in large part because of the polarization and partisanship increase in Congress that we're seeing happen as illustrated in this chart. Alright, so fewer laws are getting passed, we're getting more partisan, more polarized. So you should be asking yourself, why is this a problem in the first place? Well, as alluded to earlier, this leads to what we call policy gridlock. This is essentially when Congress just can't get anything done. This is the result of one or both sides refusing to compromise. And this makes sense if you stack up and think about what polarization is. Remember, polarization starts with othering the people who politically disagree with you having aversion to them, not wanting to spend time with them, and then moralizing them, turning them into immoral enemies, as evil. If you see the other political ideology as actually evil, then it makes sense you don't want to compromise with them to pass laws, because why would you compromise with someone who's evil? But it's not just passing of laws that gets harder. It's harder for presidential appointments to get confirmed. You remember, the Senate has the power to approve any appointments made by the president to the judgeships or key executive positions. This means that gridlock is leaving a lot of these really important positions in government unfilled for a long period of time, which further makes it harder to get anything done in our country. For example, ambassadors who represent our government in other countries are not getting their positions filled. They're being appointed by the president, but they can't actually start their jobs until the Senate approves them. This is a big deal because when the crisis broke out in Israel over a year ago between Palestine and Israel, we didn't have an ambassador there to negotiate with both sides to try to bring an end to the bloodshed. And that's because President Biden's ambassador to Israel was being held up in the Senate due to partisanship. Judges are also taking longer to get appointed. This means it's harder for people to actually get to trials when they're accused of crimes, so it's harder for them to prove their innocence, and they just have to wait a very long time before they get their day in court. It also makes it harder to send people back to their home countries who cross our borders illegally. Special immigration judges are in charge of hearing the testimony of people who cross the border who are claiming asylum, saying that essentially it's too dangerous for them to go home, and under our laws, if it's too dangerous for someone to go home to their home country after crossing into our country because of some violence or crisis back home, we legally have to let them stay in the country. But if we don't have judges in those positions, then they can't get their hearing to decide whether or not they should or should not be allowed to stay in the country. This gridlock can also make it difficult for the heads of different executive departments to get appointed to their positions. This means large parts of the government can be working without anyone in charge of their day-to-day management. This is not just true of large executive departments, which we'll be talking about more in a future unit. This is also true of military promotions. Some politicians, like this news story you see here on the left, are using partisan politics in order to block the promotions of military leaders, which is putting our military at risk. This blocking of these positions is not illegal. It's well within their powers in the Constitution. However, that partisanship is not exactly helping our country. As a result of all this, people begin to see the government as broken and incapable of solving any of our problems. As a result of this gridlock in Congress and increased partisanship, trust in Congress is near historic lows. In the 1960s, almost 80% of all Americans had trust in their government. You can see this severely dropping here into the 1970s, into the 1980s. This is in response to Americans finding out that the government had been lying to us for decades about the Vietnam War. We see some trust bounce back in the 80s, but then in the 90s it goes down again, up into the early 2000s. Right around 9/11, we reach a peak in the modern times to just about 60% of Americans trusting our government. In 2024, right before the last presidential election, trust in our government was down to 22%. That means only 1 in 5 Americans have general trust in the government being able to do the right thing and helping people. Our next key question is, how is gerrymandering making partisanship worse in Congress? We'll talk about what gerrymandering is in a minute, but for now, let's take a look at these two images on the page. These are maps showing different congressional districts. You'll remember from a previous unit that a congressional district is the group of people or the geographic area that gets to select one member to the House of Representatives. You notice here on the right image, you've got what looks like 2 different congressional districts, right? 2 different green areas. In reality, this is actually one continuous congressional district that has just been drawn to cut out this middle area and is connected by this freeway right here. Over on the left here, you see it looks like, oh wow, this is one congressional district, this is a different congressional district, and this is a different. However, nope, this is the 4th congressional district right here. It's this nice, stringy, long line here, and then it's got this little bit that you can barely see connects that goes down into here, so that the red district can have this area that wraps around it. This is what gerrymandering looks like. In essence, gerrymandering is just drawing your congressional district lines in very bizarre shapes to create the outcome you want for the election. Because there's so much data about voters out there, and we can predict pretty well how someone's going to vote in an election, we can literally draw district lines to put all Democrats into one district and all Republicans into another district so that you can guarantee who will win that election. The question you might be asking yourself now is this constitutional? Is it legal to draw district lines like this? The answer is it really depends on why you're doing it, right? There are some rules. So for instance, all districts have to have about the same population. What this means is if you have 50 people in a state and you want to make 5 districts, each district has to have 10 people in that district. So you can draw those lines in any number of ways. So this straight line has 10 people, that's 10, 10, 10, 10, creating 5 separate districts, each with 10 people. Or you could draw the line this way, or you could draw the lines this way. That is what gerrymandering is, and each of these districts has the same number of people in them, therefore, it is constitutional in that instance. Another rule, besides having to have the same number of people in each district within a state, the districts must be contiguous. That means all parts have to be touching. That is why here you can see, look, I have a line right here, this very thin street that connects this section to this section. Therefore, it's contiguous. You might be asking, do politicians really do that? Could they possibly be that petty? Well, if you look at this district over here in Texas, you can see if you zoom in, at widest, this section is 3,500 feet, and at widest, this section is only 500 feet. So yes, they do that in order to create the districts they want. Another rule is you can't draw these lines in a way that weakens the voting strength of a minority group. That is, you can't intentionally break up all people of a specific race into multiple different districts so they have no chance to elect someone. The courts have also said you also cannot draw these lines based only on race. So while you can draw lines to help increase the chances of a minority group of getting to elect someone they want, you can't make that the only reason you're drawing the lines like that. The courts have said it is 100% legal to draw these lines in such a way that gives your political party an advantage, though. Wisconsin is a fantastic example of this. So right here in front of you, you see 3 maps of voting records of the state of Wisconsin by assembly district from 2008 to 2012. So that's over 3 separate elections. In 2008, Democrats won 56% of all the votes in the state of Wisconsin, and that gave them control of 53% of all state assembly seats in our state assembly, which is like the House of Representatives for Wisconsin only. That's about equal, right? Democrats win 56% of the vote, they get 53% of the seats. That's pretty close. In 2010, Republicans won 57% of the statewide vote and got 61% of the state assembly seats. Again, these numbers are still pretty close, right? You win 57% of the vote, you get 61% of the seats. But watch what happens in 2012. Because after Republicans took control of the state assembly, they redrew the district lines to give themselves an advantage in more assembly districts. This is what gerrymandering is, redrawing the lines to give their party an advantage, right? So in 2012, Democrats won 53% of the popular vote across Wisconsin, but because of the way the lines were drawn, they only got 39% of the assembly seats. And this is because the lines were drawn to break up the voting power of Democrats and give Republicans the advantage in more assembly seats. So even though more people across the state voted for Democrats, Republicans won more of the district elections because of the way the lines were drawn. So right now, if you're scratching your head trying to figure out how exactly does this work, how did this happen, is this even legal? Well, first off, let's answer that last question. Is it legal? Yes, the courts have said it's totally fine to draw district lines in a way that gives your political party an advantage, even if it means making the people who won the majority of votes actually lose the majority of the seats. As for how does this work, well, there's 2 general tactics here, cracking and packing. So let's first talk about cracking. Cracking is when we split voters from the opposing party into multiple districts. This dilutes their voting strength in each district. So let's see how this works. So again, for instance, if we have 50 voters in the state and we want to make 5 districts, each with 10 people in them, well, we can draw those lines in different ways. If we draw the district lines in this way, we can make it so Democrats win all 5 seats, right? By putting 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans in each district. That gives Democrats the advantage in all 5 districts. Draw the lines that way, Democrats will win all 5 seats. However, if you create a jagged pattern, like a T shape here, and then a L shape, right, you're creating districts that each have 10 people in them, but Republicans will get the advantage in 1, 2, 3 districts, and Democrats will get the advantage in only 1, 2 districts. So you see, the number of Democratic and Republican voters did not change. All that changed is where you draw the lines separating the different districts. That changes the outcome of these district races. And by packing Democrats into these two districts, you can allow Republicans to win the advantage in these three districts, giving them the control of the state assembly, even though the majority of the people in the state vote for a Democrat. They're just spread out, or they're just packed into specific districts, so they have no influence really over the elections in these other two. The other way of doing this is called packing. And this is where you take all the voters of a specific party and you push them all into one single district. So that way they are guaranteed to win the vote in that one district, but they're going to have absolutely no impact on the vote in the other districts. So let's see this in action. Again, we've got a state with 50 voters, with 30 of them being blue Democrats and 20 being red Republicans. If you draw the lines this way, you've packed all the Democrats into these seats. They're guaranteed to win those three. Republicans are guaranteed to win these two. You might look at this and go, well, that's pretty fair, right? There are less Republicans, but they still get 2 seats, and there are more Democrats, and they get 3 seats. So that's fair, right? The majority still controls the assembly. But what this does is it basically means you're cutting out and making everyone in this district has the incentive to be more and more liberal when they run for politics or run for office, because they don't have to worry about what conservatives want. And over here, when you're running for office in these red districts, you don't have to worry about what liberals want, which will make these members of the assembly even more conservative. This increases partisanship and polarization in Congress and makes it more difficult for the parties to work together. Right, so let's dig deeper into how can gerrymandering lead to increased partisanship. Well, if a congressional district is drawn to make it nearly guaranteed to elect a Republican, the best way to win the primary election, which is the election that decides who will actually run in the actual election, is to be more conservative than your opponents. This pushes the packed conservative districts further and further into the conservative branch of the political ideology. In the districts where a Democrat is guaranteed to win, well, you're seeing the same thing happen, but instead of being pushed into the conservative direction, they're being pushed further liberal, making them more and more partisan for the liberal ideology. In this case, compromising if you're a Republican with a Democrat will get you challenged by a more conservative Republican in the next primary. So the best way to make sure that no one challenges you in the next election is to be as conservative as possible. And in the liberal districts, the best way to win and make sure that you don't get challenged by another liberal is by being more liberal than anyone else. Now, it's not just the way we draw districts. The media has a role to play here. So let's take a look at how media has made partisanship worse in Congress. Cable news programs have 24-hour news networks, and they make it possible now for you to choose a news source that matches your political ideology. So for more on that, go back to your notes from topic 2.2, political polarization. Now, these networks reinforce the idea that your views are right and other people's views are wrong. But here's the thing. It's not just us, the voters, watching those networks. Politicians are watching them and being influenced by them as well, and that again further and further increases their polarization and their partisanship. And thanks to gerrymandering, politicians rely more and more on winning voters who share their political ideology already, instead of trying to convince people that their ideas are the right ones. So it becomes a race to turn out your votes of people who already agree with you, and you're not really concerned about talking or convincing anyone who disagrees with you. So there's really no incentive to talk to each other in the system. This creates a cycle of polarization where the voters get more polarized, which makes the politicians more polarized, which makes the voters more polarized, which makes the politicians more polarized. And social media plays a role in this too, because they've taken the problems from cable news and they've amped it up to 1,000. Right? Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all are run by computer algorithms that decide what to show you based on what's going to keep your eyes on their apps the longest. The longer you're using the app, the more ads that you'll see, the more they can charge for ads to different companies. Also, the more data they can collect on you, which in part can be sold to politicians who can then use that to decide where to draw the gerrymandered lines for congressional assembly districts. It's all the vicious cycle. So these algorithms try to keep you on their apps by showing you things that you already agree with and the things you like. The result is they're showing you more and more of what you already agree with and then filtering out opposing views because they don't want you clicking off the app because you don't like that it showed you something you disagree with. And so that cycle continues to get more and more vicious pushing people to thinking their ideas are right and other people are wrong because they never even have to come into contact with someone or an idea that is the opposite of what they believe. These apps also know that the best way to get you engaged is by showing things that make you angry or scared, and this further increases that moralization aspect of polarization. Right? It's gotten so bad that even the head of the public school system in the state of Montana was believing misinformation, fake thing that was put out there by algorithms designed to get people upset to keep them on the apps, and they started to say that there were litter boxes in schools for kids who identified as cats. This is not true. This is absolutely not true. It did not happen anywhere in Montana, and it has not happened anywhere in the United States at all. Yet, the head of public schools in Montana says that he believed this was happening because of something he saw on his social media feed. This is even crazier again because he's the head of the public schools in the state, so he has an easy way to verify if this was true or not because he's the head of the public schools in that state. It's all designed to get you triggered so that you get angry, so you share more in the app, you stay in the app longer, and they can sell more ad space to your eyes, and they can collect more data about you that they can sell to different vendors. So why does the media do this? Well, the more eyes on a TV show, the more they can charge for a commercial. They know people who are angry or frustrated, they're going to keep watching that show because they want to know more about what's going on. They also know that telling people that what they think is wrong will get them to change the channel. So the more people they can get to watch the show, the longer they can get them to watch the show, the more ad space they can sell, and the more they can charge for that ad time. The same goes for social media apps. The more eyes on that application, the more they can charge for ad space in the app. So they want to keep your eyes on it as long as possible, so they keep feeding you videos or other posts that are going to get you more engaged. And again, that means showing you things that you already agree with, and also things that are going to get you upset. Then there's the question of how have ideological beliefs made partisanship in Congress the problem it is today? First and foremost, there are clear differences between liberals and conservatives. There are fundamental disagreements between these two ideologies about what they believe government should be about, what government should do, and how government power should be used. For a review on that, make sure you go back to topic 2.1, ideological beliefs and parties. Those notes will help you understand those differences. Right, so for instance, liberals fundamentally believe that the government can be used to help solve our problems in society, and conservatives believe government only gets in the way and causes problems. These two different views about government power don't really play well together. And this polarization has made both sides see the other side as both immoral or evil. And if something is immoral or evil, you can't compromise it. To make matters worse, if you attach religious beliefs to proposed laws like abortion bans, this increases the moralization of politics. All right, we've taken a look at the polarization and its impacts on Congress. As always, take a few minutes here, rewrite today's goal, identify 3 important facts from the notes that help you understand today's goal, and as always, please write a question that you still have about all this so I can help answer it and help you better understand what's going on in our politics today.